The battle against the void intensifies as Sigrun and her companions press deeper into its corrupted domain. In the sacred grove, once a place of Freyja's blessing, they face Skarde and the dark forces he commands. Betrayal and sacrifice shape their path as the group struggles to sever the void's growing influence. Their journey culminates in Ginnungagap, where the void's heart beats strongest. Here, Sigrun confronts Skarde in a climactic battle of strength, will and destiny. As allies fall and the cost grows heavier, Sigrun must make a choice that will define the fate of her people and her own soul. Brace yourself for a gripping conclusion filled with heartbreak, redemption, and the unyielding light of hope. Welcome to Hugin and Munin Stories. This is the final part of our story, the Forgotten Saga of Sigrun in the Shadow of Betrayal. Chapter 4: The Grove of Secrets. The frost grew thicker as the group pushed deeper into the forest, its icy tendrils weaving through the trees and across the ground like creeping veins. The air carried a sharp, unnatural chill that bit at their skin, and an oppressive silence had settled, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the frozen path. Eira walked close to Sigrun, his staff glowing faintly. "The grove lies just ahead," he said quietly, "but be ready. Its sanctity may not have survived the void's touch." Bjorn glanced at the darkened forest around them, his axe ready in his hands. "The air feels heavier, like it's waiting for something." "It's him," Sigrun said, her voice hard. "He's already here." The trees thinned suddenly, giving way to a clearing bathed in an otherworldly light. The grove was beautiful, yet unsettling, a place where nature had fought valiantly to preserve its sanctity, but had been tainted by a darker presence. Towering golden-leafed trees circled the clearing, their branches forming a protective canopy overhead. At the grove's centre stood a massive stone altar, its surface carved with intricate runes that glowed faintly. But the altar was marred, tendrils of shadow coiled around its base, pulsating with a sickly, unnatural light. The frost here was alive, creeping and writhing like a living thing. Ingrid tightened her grip on her axe. "This doesn't feel right." "It's not," Eira said grimly. The grove was a place of Freyja's blessing, a sanctuary, but the void has begun to corrupt it. At the far end of the clearing, a figure stepped out from the shadows. Skarde. His armour shimmered with an oily black sheen, and his eyes burned with an unnatural fire. In his hand was a fragment of a relic glowing faintly, its light twisted by the void's influence. "So you found me," he said, his voice cold and mocking. "I was wondering how long it would take." Sigrun stepped forward, her sword drawn, her shield ready. "It ends here, Skarde." He chuckled, the sound echoing eerily through the grove. "Do you really think you can stop this, Sigrun? The void's power is beyond anything you or your gods can comprehend." Bjorn moved to Sigrun's side, his axe gleaming in the faint light. "You betrayed us. You destroyed villages. You think we'll let you get away with this?" Skarde smirked. "I didn't betray anyone. I saw the truth, Bjorn. The gods are weak. They take and take, offering nothing in return. The void, however, gives freely." "The void destroys," Eira said sharply, stepping forward. "It's not a gift, it's a parasite." Skarde's gaze flicked to Eira, his expression darkening. "And yet, here you are, meddling in things you don't understand. The grove's power belongs to the void now, and soon it will belong to me." Skarde raised his hand, and the shadows around the altar surged, forming into grotesque creatures with jagged claws and glowing eyes. They moved with unnatural speed, lunging toward the group. Sigrun raised her shield, meeting the first creature head-on. The impact rattled her arm, but she held firm, her sword slicing through its form. The creature dissolved into mist, but more were already swarming. Bjorn roared, his axe cleaving through the shadowy forms with brutal precision. Ingrid fought with equal ferocity, her movements swift and calculated. Eira stood near the altar, his staff glowing as he chanted, his voice steady despite the chaos. "The altar!" Eira shouted. "They're tied to it. We need to sever their connection. Sigrun pushed forward, cutting down another creature as she moved toward the altar. The runes carved into its surface flickered, their light dimming and flaring erratically. Skarde stood beside it, watching the battle with a calm, almost amused expression. "Do you see, Sigrun?" he called out. "This is the power you could have had if you weren't blinded by loyalty to the gods." The creatures were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. Sigrun reached the altar, her sword striking the tendrils of shadow that coiled around it. Each strike sent a pulse of light through the runes, disrupting their glow. Bjorn and Ingrid fought to keep the creatures at bay, their weapons flashing in the dim light. "We can't hold them off forever," Ingrid shouted, her voice strained. "You won't have to," Ira said, his chant growing louder. The runes on the altar flickered more intensely, the shadows writhing as though in pain. Skarde's expression darkened, and he raised his corrupted relic, its light flaring. "You can't stop this," he snarled. "The void is inevitable." Sigrun turned to him, her sword blazing with Freyja's light. "Then I'll stop you." Their blades met in a clash of steel and energy, the force of it sending shockwaves through the grove. Skarde was fast, his strikes fueled by the void's power, but Sigrun matched him blow for blow, her determination unyielding. Ira's chant reached a crescendo, and the runes on the altar flared brightly. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The creatures vanished, leaving only silence. As the light from the altar dimmed, the grove fell still. The frost receded slightly, and the air felt lighter. But when Sigrun turned to where Skarde had stood, he was gone. "He escaped," Bjorn said, his voice filled with frustration. Ira approached the altar, his expression grim. "He's heading for the relic. If he reaches it, the void's influence will be complete." Sigrun tightened her grip on her sword, her jaw set. "Then we follow. He won't get far." The group left the grove, the weight of their mission heavier than before. The golden leaves of the trees shimmered faintly, a reminder of the grove's once sacred power. Sigrun looked back only once, her heart heavy with the knowledge that Skarde was still out there. But her resolve burned brighter than ever. They would stop him, no matter the cost. Chapter 5. The Descent into Ginnungagap. The path into Ginnungagap was like walking into the mouth of a great beast. The jagged cliffs towered on either side, the air thick and cold, carrying an oppressive weight that pressed down on Sigrun and her companions. Darkness seeped from the edges of the chasm, not just an absence of light, but a presence, a living void that seemed to pulse and breathe. Sigrun led the way, her sword drawn, its faint glow offering a fragile comfort. Ira followed close behind, his staff glowing softly, a counterpoint to the darkness that loomed ahead. Bjorn and Ingrid brought up the rear, their weapons ready, their eyes scanning the shadows. "This is where the void's heart beats strongest," Ira said, his voice low, "and where Skarde will make his final stand." Sigrun glanced back at her companions, their faces etched with determination. "We stop him here," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." The descent into the chasm was slow and treacherous. The path was narrow, winding its way down the cliffside in a series of steep, crumbling steps. Frost clung to the rocks, and every step felt like a test of balance and will. The whispers began as they reached the halfway point, faint and indistinct at first, like the rustling of leaves. But as they moved deeper, the voices grew louder, more insistent, shaping themselves into familiar tones. Bjorn froze suddenly, his hand tightening on his axe. "I hear her," he said, his voice strained. "My mother, she's calling for me." "It's not real," Ingrid said sharply, though her own gaze flickered nervously to the shadows. "Don't let it in." But the whispers were relentless, weaving their way into each of their minds. For Sigrun, it was her father's voice, sharp and accusing. "You failed me, Sigrun. You failed the village." She gritted her teeth, shaking her head. "The void knows our fears," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "It feeds on them. Ignore it." Ira's staff pulsed with light, pushing back the encroaching shadows. "Keep moving. The void will do everything it can to break you." At the bottom of the chasm, the path opened into a vast cavern, its scale impossible to comprehend. The walls glistened with a dark, tar-like substance that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The air was colder here, biting and heavy, making it hard to breathe. At the cavern's centre stood a monolithic structure, its surface etched with glowing runes that flickered like dying embers. Tendrils of shadow coiled around its base, writhing and shifting like living things. "That's it," Era said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The void's heart." A figure stood before the monolith, his back to them. Skarde. His armour gleamed darkly in the faint light, and the relic in his hand pulsed with an ominous energy. "You're too late," Skarde said without turning. His voice echoed unnaturally in the cavern. "The void has already claimed this place. Soon, it will claim everything." Skarde turned to face them, his eyes blazing with void energy. He raised the relic, and the shadows surged, coalescing into twisted creatures that lunged at the group. "Hold the line!" Sigrun shouted, raising her shield as the first creature struck. The impact rattled her arm, but she pushed back, driving her sword through its form. The creature screamed, dissolving into mist. But two more took its place. Bjorn and Ingrid fought side by side, their weapons carving through the shadowy horde. Era stood near the monolith, his staff glowing brighter as he began to chant, his voice resonating with power. "The monolith is their anchor," Era called out. "We have to sever their connection to it." Sigrun nodded, pushing her way toward the monolith. Each step was a struggle, the shadows pressing against her like a physical force. Skarde moved to intercept her, his blades striking with unnatural speed and precision. Their swords clashed, the sound ringing through the cavern. "You can't stop this, Sigrun," Skarde snarled. "The void is inevitable." "You're wrong," she said, her voice firm. "The void destroys. It takes everything." As the battle raged, Era reached the monolith, his chant growing louder. The runes on its surface began to flicker and dim, and the shadows around them faltered. Skarde noticed, his eyes narrowing. "No!" he roared, raising the relic. A wave of shadow lashed out, aiming for Era. Sigrun moved instinctively, intercepting the attack with her shield. The force of it sent her skidding back, but she held firm. "Keep going, Era!" Era's chant reached a crescendo, and the light from his staff flared brightly. The monolith trembled, cracks spreading across its surface. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness. But the light consumed Era as well. His form flickered, and he turned to Sigrun, his expression calm despite the pain. "My purpose ends here," he said. "Protect the balance." Before she could respond, his form dissolved into light, merging with the monolith as it shattered. The cavern trembled as the monolith crumbled, its power broken. Skarde staggered, his connection to the void faltering, but his eyes burned with fury. "You've delayed the inevitable," he said, his voice venomous. "The void will return, and when it does, you won't be there to stop it." He raised the relic, and a rift opened behind him. Before Sigrun could stop him, he stepped through, vanishing into the shadows. The cavern grew still, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. Bjorn and Ingrid approached Sigrun, their faces lined with exhaustion and grief. "He's gone," Ingrid said softly. "But so is Era." Sigrun stared at the shattered remains of the monolith, her chest tight. "We've won this battle," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "But the war isn't over." The group made their way back to the surface, the void's presence lingering in the back of their minds. Sigrun knew they had delayed the void's advance, but the cost had been high. Era's light was gone, but his sacrifice would not be in vain. She looked to the horizon, determination burning in her eyes. Whatever came next, she would be ready. Chapter 6. The Final Reckoning. The air grew heavier as Sigrun, Bjorn, and Ingrid pressed forward through the remnants of the corrupted forest. The void's influence lingered, a spectral weight pressing against their minds and bodies. Era's sacrifice had severed the monolith's hold on the void-touched creatures, but Skarde's escape had left an uneasy silence in its wake. The trio reached a clearing at the forest's edge, where jagged rocks formed a natural amphitheatre. In its centre stood Skarde, his armour blackened and pulsing with void energy. The relic in his hand glowed faintly, its light fractured and unstable. "Welcome," Skarde said, his voice carrying an unnatural echo. "You're just in time to witness the void's ascension." Sigrun stepped forward, her shield raised and her sword drawn. "You've run far enough, Skarde. It ends here." Skarde laughed, the sound grating like shattered glass. "You still don't understand, do you? The void isn't just power, it's freedom, from gods, from destiny, from everything that binds us." Without another word, Skarde raised the relic, and the ground beneath them shifted. Shadows coalesced into monstrous forms, twisting and writhing as they lunged at the group. Sigrun charged forward, her shield slamming into the first creature as her sword cleaved through its form. Bjorn and Ingrid moved as one, their weapons a blur as they fought to keep the creatures at bay. "These things just keep coming," Bjorn growled, his axe splitting another shadowy form. "They're tied to Skarde," Ingrid shouted, cutting through a creature that lunged at her. "We have to stop him." Skarde watched from the centre of the clearing, his eyes glowing with malice. He raised the relic and the shadows surged, their movements faster and more coordinated. Sigrun pushed towards Skarde, her movements precise and relentless. Their swords met in a clash of steel and energy, the force of each blow sending shockwaves through the clearing. "You've lost everything, Skarde," Sigrun said, her voice steady despite the strain. "You gave up your people, your honour, for this, and you cling to your gods like a child to a broken toy." Skarde snarled, his strikes fueled by the void's energy. "You think they care about you? They use you, just as they use everyone." His blade struck her shield, the impact reverberating through her arm. Sigrun gritted her teeth, pushing back with all her strength. "You're wrong. The gods don't choose our path. We do." Skarde hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "And yet, here you are, playing their pawn." As the battle raged, Bjorn and Ingrid fought their way to Sigrun's side. Together, they forced Skarde back toward the edge of the clearing. The relic in his hand pulsed erratically, its light dimming and flaring as though unstable. Ira's voice echoed faintly in Sigrun's mind. "The void destroys itself when it's denied. Keep him distracted!" Sigrun shouted, lunging towards Skarde with renewed fury. Her sword struck his armour, shattering part of its void-enhanced surface. Skarde stumbled, his grip on the relic faltering. Bjorn tackled one of the remaining shadow creatures, his axe cleaving it in two. "The relic, it's the key! Destroy it!" As the relic shattered, its energy erupted in a blinding flash, throwing Sigrun and her companions back. The clearing was filled with a deafening roar as the void's tether to the world was severed. When the light faded, the once pulsing shadows were gone, leaving only stillness. Skarde lay sprawled on the ground, his armour cracked and his once burning eyes now dull. He struggled to rise, his movements slow and weak, like a marionette with broken strings. Sigrun approached cautiously, her sword still in hand, her eyes locked on his frail form. "You think this is victory?" Skarde rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The void, it never forgets. You've only delayed the inevitable." Sigrun knelt beside him, her shield lowered, but her resolve unshaken. "You had a choice, Skarde. You could have fought for your people, for something greater than yourself." A bitter smile tugged at his lips, though it was laced with pain. "You don't understand. I did this for them, for the weak, for those the gods abandoned." She frowned, her grip tightening on her sword. "You betrayed them. You destroyed everything you were meant to protect." His gaze flickered, a shadow of regret crossing his face. "Betrayal? No. I wanted freedom. Freedom from their chains. But the void... His voice broke, and he coughed weakly, blood staining his lips. It takes everything. For a moment, Sigrun hesitated. Despite everything, despite the lives he had destroyed, there was something human in his final moments, a man who had reached too far, who had been consumed by his own hubris. "It's over," she said softly, rising to her feet. "You can't hurt anyone anymore." Skarde's body trembled, his strength failing. His final words were barely audible. "You'll see. The gods are no better. They'll take from you too." And with that, his body crumbled into ash, carried away by the wind. Sigrun stood silently, her sword lowered, the weight of his words lingering in her mind. The cavern grew still, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. Bjorn and Ingrid approached Sigrun, their faces lined with exhaustion. "He's gone," Ingrid said softly. "But so is Eira." Sigrun stared at the clearing, her chest tight. "We've won this battle," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "But the war isn't over." The group made their way back to the village, the void's presence lingering faintly in the back of their minds. Sigrun knew they had delayed the void's advance, but the cost had been high. Eira's light was gone, but his sacrifice would not be in vain. She looked to the horizon, determination burning in her eyes. Whatever came next, she would be ready. Epilogue: A light in the darkness. The village was quiet that evening, the fjord bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Sigrun stood by the shore, her feet sinking slightly into the wet sand. The rhythmic lapping of the waves against the rocks was soothing, a stark contrast to the chaos she had faced. She held Eira's staff in her hands, its glow now faint and fading. It felt lighter than she expected, as though the power it once held had been drained with his passing. Yet, in its absence, she felt something else, something simpler but no less profound: peace. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie, and she turned to see Bjorn and Ingrid approaching. Bjorn carried his axe over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Ingrid held a bundle of wildflowers, her eyes scanning the horizon. "You should rest," Bjorn said, his tone softer than usual. "The village needs you tomorrow." "The village will always need someone," Sigrun replied, her voice distant. "But I'm not sure they need me." "They need someone who'll fight for them," Ingrid said, stepping closer. "And you've done that better than anyone." Sigrun looked at them, her expression torn. "Eira's gone, my father's gone, Skarde's shadow might be gone, but the void, it's not finished." Bjorn grunted, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We'll face it, together." Ingrid nodded, her eyes steady. "You're not alone, Sigrun. We'll carry this weight with you." For the first time in days, Sigrun smiled. It was small, tentative, but real. She turned back to the water, her gaze fixed on the horizon. That night, Sigrun sat by the village fire, surrounded by her people. She listened to their laughter, their stories, their dreams of rebuilding. And though the void's whispers still lingered faintly in her mind, they no longer held the same power over her. She whispered a quiet prayer to Freyja, not for strength, but for clarity. And as the fire crackled, she felt a faint warmth in her chest, a promise, perhaps, that balance could be found, even in the face of darkness. And with that, we say goodbye for this time. Thank you for listening to part 2 of our story, The Forgotten Saga of Sigrun in the Shadow of Betrayal.